I felt alone, scared, unwanted, like I didn't have a say in my life, until I met Trisha and Jeremy. They gave me the support, the home, and love I never had before. It's why I succeeded in school, and I'm able to do what I'm passionate about today. Now I'm ready to make it on my own because I know they'll always be there for me if I need them. And that is why I say yes to foster care. I felt alone, scared, unwanted, like I didn't have a say in my life, until I met Trisha and Jeremy. They gave me the support, the home, and love I never had before. It's why I succeeded in school, and I'm able to do what I'm passionate about today. Now I'm ready to make it on my own because I know they'll always be there for me if I need them. And that is why I say yes to foster care. I felt alone, scared, unwanted, like I didn't have a say in my life, until I met Trisha and Jeremy. They gave me the support, the home, and love I never had before. It's why I succeeded in school, and I'm able to do what I'm passionate about today. Now I'm ready to make it on my own because I know they'll always be there for me if I need them. And that is why I say yes to foster care.
Good morning to you. Thanks for joining us for the State of Foster Care Town Hall. We are going to get started in just about 5 minutes. But remember, if you have questions for our conversation today, we're looking forward to them. Just put them in the Q&A window and we will get to them as we continue our chat today. So we are going to begin in 5 minutes. We are so glad that you are with us.
I felt alone, scared, unwanted, like I didn't have a say in my life, until I met Trisha and Jeremy. They gave me the support, the home, and love I never had before. It's why I succeeded in school, and I'm able to do what I'm passionate about today. Now I'm ready to make it on my own because I know they'll always be there for me if I need them. And that is why I say yes to foster care. I felt alone, scared, unwanted, like I didn't have a say in my life, until I met Trisha and Jeremy. They gave me the support, the home, and love I never had before. It's why I succeeded in school, and I'm able to do what I'm passionate about today. Now I'm ready to make it on my own because I know they'll always be there for me if I need them. And that is why I say yes to foster care.
Well, good morning. It is 11 o'clock, so we are going to get started. I'm Christy McDonald. Thank you so much for being with us. I am honored to be leading the discussion today about the state of foster care in Michigan. Samaritas came and asked me to help facilitate this conversation. And as you may know, Samaritas is Michigan's largest nonprofit foster care agency, serves 3,500 children and families each year. Thousands of children enter the foster care system each year, and the goal is to work with birth families to overcome barriers and to reignite with their children. And that work extends to the courts and the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. It really is a multi-layered effort, and it's good to step back and see the biggest challenges that families are facing, the system as a whole, and the need for more foster families. Specifically today, though, we are going to be exploring the bias in foster care, why it seems that foster care kids of color receive a different level of care than their white peers. What are the reasons behind it, and what is being done to address it? We want to make sure that we hear from you during this entire town hall. So if you have any questions or comments about the things that we're discussing, and I'm going to make sure that we get to your questions near the end of the town hall, just go into the Q&A and we will get to them as we move along. All right, so let me bring in the panelists who will be part of this discussion for the next hour or so. Demetrius Starling, he is the Executive Director for Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, Children's Services Agency. He oversees the state's child welfare system, including Children's Protective Services, the foster care system, adoption services, family preservation services, and juvenile justice programs. And in the past, Demetrius served as Children's Services Agency's In-Home Services Bureau Director, overseeing prevention, preservation, and protection programs. Demetrius, we are awfully glad that you are here with us this morning. It's good to see you.
Thank you for having me, Christy. Appreciate it.
Okay. Also with us on the panel is Brenda Baker-Mbacke. She is currently the CASA director under the umbrella agency of Care House of Oakland County. And if you are unfamiliar, CASA stands for Court Appointed Special Advocates. She has more than 35 years of child welfare experience and has been the executive director of 2 agencies offering direct services to children and families and working in the areas of foster care, licensing, delinquency, residential treatment, and adoption. We are so glad that we have the gift of your experience here today, Brenda. It's good to see you.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Also with us this morning is Kim Reese. Kim is the director of the Office of Race, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. She's a Flint native with more than 22 years of experiences with the state of Michigan. And prior to her current role, she supervised training for all child welfare staff at MDHHS and private child welfare agencies in Michigan. She also worked as a Children's Protective Services investigator in Genesee County. Kim, it's good to have you here this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
And finally, Trisha Sverns. Trisha is a director at Samaritas, overseeing foster care and family preservation programs in West Michigan. She has been working with children and families for over 26 years. Trisha started with Samaritas in 2010 as foster care supervisor. And before coming to Samaritas, Trisha began her social work career working at St. Vincent Home for Children in Lansing, and then Kaleidoscope Incorporated, a private treatment foster care agency in Chicago. She is also on the leadership team for the CSA Anti-Racism Transformation Team and is the co-chair for the Michigan Federation for Children and Families EDI Member Interest Network. Trisha, it is good to see you. Thanks for being here this morning.
Thanks, Christy.
You know, there's no doubt that we have the most experienced panel here for this discussion. And as we start our conversation on the foster care system here in Michigan and zeroing in really on the issues of bias, there is a need for more licensed foster care homes. Last year, Samaritas could only place 13% of referred children, but that situation really is worse for children of color. I'd like to start off by just going around to each one of you from your vantage point and perspective in the system. What exactly are we seeing here when we talk about bias? And Demetrius, I'm going to start from you, looking at overall the state level.
Yes, thank you, Christy. So from my perspective, I think that one of the things that we as a child welfare system have struggled with mightily, over the past couple of years or even the past several decades is having that race equity lens applied to the work that we do. I think that when you look at the conflation of poverty, when you look at some of the extenuating circumstances that people of color and marginalized communities are up against, I think we have really kind of failed in some senses. We need to have a more prevention or preservation kind of mindset. And I know that we and the rest of the group will talk about that some more later during the presentation. But looking to work upstream more is what we should, as a child welfare system, do. And by doing that, we can look at different ways to help keep down the over-representation of children of color in the system, in the child welfare system. Part of that also is training. And I know that the overall mindset should always be, we can't train issues away. But we do need to have a cultural awareness perspective when it comes to how we encounter, engage, and interact with families of color. Their challenges are different than other demographics, and we need to be cognizant and aware of that. These are just a couple of strategies that we're utilizing within the department. And I know that with this, again, the race equity lens and having a keen focus on how we could be of more value to our communities of color versus being a detriment, is something that my administration are keenly aware of and focused on.
Yeah, deliberate practice and awareness. And we're going to get more in depth on that in just a little bit. Brenda, let me go over to you and just give me kind of your view of where we stand right now in some of the issues that you've been confronting. Brenda, you're on mute.
Thank you. I think that we need to start the discussion by defining what is race and ethnicity and implicit and explicit bias. We know, race and ethnicities are terms that are often used together, and race tends to be associated with biology, whereas ethnicity is associated with culture. So both individual and system biases can be intentional, but are often unintentional or implicit. Implicit or unconscious biases are thoughts and feelings that exist outside of our conscious awareness, and consequently are different or difficult to acknowledge and to control consciously. Explicit biases or attitudes or thoughts and feelings that people deliberately think about and can make conscious reports about. These types of biases are commonly termed stereotypes. And I think that we all have to be, or we all are unconsciously characterize a newly encountered person or a friend or an enemy, even before we get the chance to get to know them. And this tends to happen because of the brain's mental shortcuts. And so we see this in our workers when they are making a decision as to whether or not they should remove a child from a home. And we all know that children of color or African-American children are removed at a higher rate than any other race.
And we will get, and I will share some of those statistics so we can really get a complete understanding of the picture that we're looking for. And Kim, I want to go with you. And I'm so glad, Brenda, that you were defining a lot of those terms that we're going to be talking about today. Kim, give us your sense of where we stand right now in our overall issues.
Yep. So thank you, Christy. So something that's very important to me is the beginning of this. So we talk about Black and brown children, children of color, in particular African-American or Black children, and the exponential number of rate that they come into care. We have to look at where it begins. And it really does begin with the mandated reporters or the people who are calling in. And so we're looking at incorporating, we've already began incorporating some implicit bias into our mandated reporter training, because people who are making those calls, we encourage them, when you are making that call, would you be making this call on someone who looks like you or someone who's in your neighborhood? And so it's very important when we look at making calls to centralized intake for us to challenge and manage our bias. We all have bias, whether or not if we want to admit to it or not, we have bias. and we have to manage that bias. And so looking at how those calls come in, Director Starling is doing a really good job. We are working with an outside entity and helping to revamp our structured decision-making tools to make sure that we're utilizing an equity lens when we are assessing our families. So we are also in our training department, the Office of Workforce Development and Training. We're looking at making sure that we incorporate not just one time as a checkbox, but that we are incorporating implicit bias and cultural competence and cultural awareness training in our training to our new workers. So it's a parallel approach. We can't just do it one time and think that it's okay. We know that there are multiple angles that we have to try to manage this thing called bias.
You know, it's going to be interesting, and I'm glad that we're going to be able to get into it, is the chain of command, where it goes from that initial report, and then if it gets put onto a caseworker, and the decisions that are made, are there wraparound services for a family first before there is some kind of removal. So I'm so glad that we're going to be able to kind of go through the process and see where the bias is in the system, and then also what you said, Kim's recognizing that we all have bias and saying that, okay, and if you are watching us right now and participating in this town hall, to maybe just sit for a moment and say, what are some of the bias that I have in my own mind that I have maybe put on in other situations that have changed my thought process? And this is what we're talking about. And it's a deliberate thought process. Trisha, let me go to you and kind of get your overall sense from your vantage point and the work you're doing on the western side of the state.
Yeah, so I would echo everything that was already said by the other panelists. I think they all articulated the issue really well. And I would agree with Kim that I think it's not just a matter of doing one training about implicit or unconscious bias. It's really an ongoing discussion with your teams about how does that play out in our daily practice. You know, so you have a training, but then you also want to have follow-up discussion and probably follow-up trainings about that. Because what we see, like Demetrius said, is on the front end, we see a higher number of children of color that are being called into CPS, but then they also see a higher number of those cases that are assigned for investigation, higher number of those kids get removed, and they just stay in the system, and it kind of gets worse over time. So they end up on the back end of our system in higher numbers, even than they did at the beginning. So it's definitely, the data supports that the bias is there throughout the process.
And I'm so glad that you brought that up, because that was my next point. Because when we were talking earlier, Trisha, you were the one that said, look, you got to look up the Child Welfare Improvement Task Force report. And Demetrius, of course, you're instrumental in putting that out, just to give people some numbers. And it was rolling in some of the slides that started just before our town hall. 16% of children in Michigan are Black, but children who are Black make up 29% of the foster care population. And also 31% of children in Michigan are children of color. They make up 51% of the foster care population. What also really stuck with me is that children of color are more likely to be placed in institutional settings. You've already mentioned this before, stay there for longer periods of time, and age out of foster care without a family. And we're going to get into what the impact is on those children as they become adults and go on in their life. Demetrius, let me start with you. When you were putting together those reports and seeing the things that came back and talking to people, and then coming up with what are some of the solutions that we can slowly work towards? What were some of the surprise in the numbers and some of the things that we really need to concentrate on?
Thank you, Christy. This is a great question. I'm so glad that we're able to touch on it. So with the Michigan Child Welfare Task Force, we thought it was critical, very important for us to bring together the department. So we tapped on stakeholders. We have folks, we have jurists, we have folks who are situated in our communities to come together and provide us with their input, provide us with some feedback on how we can transform our system. And so as a result, we've convened for over a year now, and with the mindset of redesigning a front-end response to allegations of child abuse and neglect that's free from bias. Kim talked about it earlier about how we are working with specific agencies such as the Ideas 42 and Evident Change, and they're helping us restructure our own tools. They're helping us with, re-enhancing some of our own practices, looking at our own language and how we can kind of change our child welfare system altogether. And what we found when we talked about reducing some of those racial disparities and increasing that support for our families was that there was a lack of awareness across the board when it comes to safety and well-being of care, of kids in care, and also how we can partner with other folks in the community to identify some of those alternative interventions to keep kids of color out of care. It has been an amazing journey. We've had folks from the legislative body really advocate for us, not only from a practice standpoint, but from a monetary standpoint, to provide us with some input and also ideas on how we can ask and request particular monies and grants to help some of our folks at impoverished communities, such as, uplifting family learning centers, providing prevention-based services within some communities like Flint and Saginaw, Pontiac and Detroit, but also exploring some possible funding, more prevention intervention services to help redirect some of those families that come to the attention of our child welfare system. I've said it time and time again, my administration's drive right now is to kind of narrow that front door of CPS intervention and open up a wider door for prevention. We feel as if folks in the community are best situated to give us some ideas on how to keep kids, not only kids of color, but kids in really oppressed and marginalized communities together and safe in their communities. But overall, it affects our children of color more so than others. So we are really excited about some of the recommendations that are coming forward. And it's evident that not only our department and private agency stakeholders as well, but the jurists and our legislative partners really are starting to turn the corner, and they have an idea or a bigger grasp of how these practices and policies that we've adhered to for so long can kind of dismantle some of our Black and brown communities. So to see this work come together is extremely exciting. It's invigorating. And I think that we are starting to see some of the effects of us putting these ideas in place here.
Brenda, talk to me about the impact on the kids, because this is the bottom line on these children's lives who end up in foster care or waiting for foster care in this system. How is this impacting them long-term? And if they age out of foster care without a family?
Well, we want to know and believe that we are treating everyone the same, with the same amount of compassion, regardless of their race, culture, nationality, religion, age, or gender. But if we really examine our thoughts and beliefs honestly, we may sometimes notice hints of judgments and negative biases just below the surface of our conscious mind. These can affect the quality of all of our interactions, whether it's with our clients or coworkers or even strangers. But when we're using the lens of systems theory to conceptualize the foster care system, it reveals key decision points vulnerable to bias, where the high risk of secondary harm to children in foster care can far outweigh any benefits of the removal from the children's own home. Professionals in the foster care system, we routinely contend that African-American children are the most at risk for child abuse and neglect. That is a presumption that is currently reflected in our system, but is not accurate. Based on this belief, the system removes these children from their families at a higher rate, as I stated before, than any other race. Children of color are more likely, as you stated earlier, to experience poor outcomes. They tend to have multiple placements. They're less likely to be reunited with their birth families. They're more likely to experience residential care, less likely to establish a permanent placement, and more likely to experience poor social, behavioral, and educational outcomes. And whether this disproportionate representation in foster care of African-American children is justified or biased is the question that is in an ongoing debate, an ongoing national debate, because it's not just Michigan. This is happening all over our country. And so the nation's poorest children, not surprisingly, make up most of the foster care population. African Americans are disproportionately poor, and that correlation increases the probability of foster care for them. I think these unintended bias manifest and consequently affect decisions regarding which children are actually removed from their families and placed in the foster care system.
And Trisha, let me ask you, coming off of that and looking at what kind of bias that we're maybe even seeing once a placement happens, is there more work that we could be doing to try to keep families together without a removal of a child? But then once a child does go to a family, what are some of the bias that a child might see in the foster system with a foster care family?
Yeah, I think that what we see, at least I can speak for West Michigan, but I think this is true, as Brenda said, nationwide, not just here in Michigan. But most of our foster homes that we've been able to recruit are typically, at least on the west side, you know, they're white foster homes. We really are in need of more homes of color so that we can put kids, place them when we have to put them in foster care, in homes where they feel like it's someone who looks like them, who has similar culture. But ideally, I think what we always want to do is place them with family whenever we can. And I think there is some bias at play there, because sometimes families come to us not because they want to be foster parents, but because a child was removed. And so they're put into a position where someone's asking them to please, you know, take this child on and care for them. So they also have histories sometimes that don't necessarily present safety issues, but there's bias there. So some workers may think, well, this child's better off in a home that can provide more for them in a nicer community. And I don't think that that's necessarily true. So yeah, I think that I'll let the other panelists add to that if they'd like to.
Kim, is there something you want to add to that? Kim, is there something you want to add to that? Okay.
Yep. So, no, I think Trisha, you're spot on, and just all of this conversation is just so important. When you were talking with Director Starling and Brenda, I was just thinking about the educational impact. So we know that children, when they are in placement, they may not be at their school of origin, and then when you think about placing them in a different home, and then yet again, if they have to be replaced, like that's detrimental. Every time a child has to be placed or replaced in a different educational setting, then they're losing valuable educational time. And so that's something that we really have to pay close attention to. Is very important, because we want to make sure that our young people don't fall into that school to prison pipeline. And so very early on, this is something that we have to pay close attention to, because it really does have an impact on our children of color, as we're starting to see in national studies around the school to prison pipeline.
All right, I really am appreciating all the questions that are coming in on the side. I want to address some of them. First off, if you do want access to that, the Child Welfare Improvement Task Force report, you can find it online, correct, Demetrius?
Correct, yeah. We can definitely provide the links to the folks here if they want to gain access to the data, but we have several front-facing dashboards that we try to be as transparent as possible with our foster care data, with the number of kids who are in care, so folks can readily access those. But yes, we can definitely provide that information.
Yeah, it's important for people to be able to see it. If you want to go in, again, you talk about transparency and being able to address some of these issues. And someone asked, and Kim, I'm going to bounce back to you on this, is this bias happening at the state level, CSP? So when you go ahead and you look at program-wise and talk about instituting some kind of training, what do you have to look at specifically? And then how do you go about changing perception and saying, well, it's not just one day of training and we're all cured of bias and we should all be good from now on? What is the ongoing conversation or the mandate of saying we need to do this quarterly or even more? What does it look like?
So there is a lot packed into that question. And so I think that part of what I saw in that question was like working with the courts. Certainly we know that Director Starling is working with our courts. And so we are in conversation with them, both Director Starling, myself, Trisha, we are in the child welfare transformational, anti-racist transformational team. And so we do have jurists who are a part of that. And we have other anti-racist transformation teams that are growing. And we also are inviting our court colleagues to that. And so as far as the training component, and so we, like we previously mentioned, it's not good enough just to have training, or even if we have a catalog of training. So we know that change has to happen from the top. So we do need our leaders to help. And we're not just talking about race and racism, which is very important. But we also, when we're talking about gender identities, when we're talking about equity, period, we know that having our leaders on board to make sure that change is happening is very important, and is something that is necessary. And so it's time out for us to not have the conversation, but for us to continue to have the conversation. We have to challenge the status quo. And so when you're talking about having new hires on board, we can't just say, forget about what you learned in training. This is the way that we're going to do things. We need systems changes. We need a cultural change, like that culture and climate in that local office, in that agency to change. And that change really is going to have to start from the top. We need to make sure that our senior leaders are on board when we're talking about equity and equity changes.
Demetrius, do you want to follow up on that?
Absolutely. I think Director Reese made some really profound points. And, you know, one of the things that's embedded in my priorities with children's services is ensuring that there are equitable child welfare practices across the board. So it's not just a conversation of Black and Brown. You know, like Kim lifted up, we are talking about families with disabilities, you know, LGBTQI community, making sure that folks understand the importance of incorporating minority males and even women in our workforce and in our practices and also our decision making. And it makes for a more concise environment. And I think that once, you know, because let's be honest, talking about race and race equity that's pretty palatable. That's not a hard conversation to have. One of the more difficult decisions or conversations to have is in regards to anti-racism work. And that's what we're doing right now. We're kind of enhancing some of our laws, our practices, and policies to comport with some of our anti-racist principles. And we have some things going on, not only with my leadership team, but also across the state. One of the things that I definitely wanted to talk about here today was the Kent County removal meetings. That, you know, there's a fantastic group of folks who have come together under the guidance and support from the University of Michigan to look at the removals in that particular county with the initial goal to reduce the disproportionality of children who are coming into care. And what was astounding from that is it was a blind removal process where we looked at some of the cases and we just took away all the identifying factors, right? So you don't know where this family's address was, so we don't know about their racial background or demographics. And we just talked about how we identify family strengths, you know, looking at barriers to service, looking at that family's background. And what we saw, unfortunately, is that there was a 3.5% chance, or more than 3.5% percentage of those families having kids removed from their care. I'm sorry, 35, I said 3.5, 35% likelihood, more so than other demographics, to have their kids removed from their care than other races, which was telling. That means that we need to be very purposeful and intentional with our actions, make sure that we have some consistent decision-making across the board. We have to look at, again, implicit bias and have that discussion. You know, one of the things that we need to do, of course, is to provide support to our workers. We have workers out there, you know, in the communities who don't have that cultural awareness. They don't have that sense of, this is how I broach certain subjects or discussion topics with certain families. So this is something, again, like Kim stated, starting from the top down. We know that we have to not only talk the talk, but walk the walk. So we're having some really robust and concrete conversations with our staff to address some of these outcomes that we feel are in need for our children of color going forward.
Yeah, I love what, you know, Kim said, talking about the training and then going to you, who is the top, essentially, and setting the tone. Brenda, let me ask you, and how do we then talk to people who are working within the system who say, no, my experience shows me that this is X, Y, and Z, and it's always going to turn out that way? And how do you deal with someone who is working within the system and their implicit bias of saying, oh, but no, it's my experience. I know that this is what the outcome is going to be in that, you know, in the workforce?
Well, that's a loaded question. Because eliminating bias is very, very difficult. When, you know, as Kim and I'm sorry, Demetrius, Director Starling talked about, training. And training is a key component, but more importantly, it's the follow-up that matters. So sometimes you have to work directly with these workers to help them understand where a bias impacts their case or impacts their decisions. I think that we have often created case treatment plans or parent agency treatment plans that look very similar. Basically saying all families are the same when they come into the system. And that is absolutely not the case. And we need to look at each case by case and make the most appropriate decisions based on that case and not what other cases have looked like. You also have to be careful about experience versus bias. So sometimes people see their bias as experience, and that's not necessarily the case. And that's when we start to see these cookie cutter treatment plans applied to each family. Or we make the assumption when we go out to remove that because I see this situation here, it is the same situation that I saw yesterday, therefore there's a pattern. And so if I removed yesterday, I have to remove today. Again, you need to look at each case. Changing how people view the world is very difficult. And I think that we've all experienced that, if no other time within the last 2.5 years during the pandemic. Because if you look at, a lot of people have decided that the world is more black and white than they believed it to be. And so I think that, people are also accepting the fact that they need to do the work. They need to make changes in terms of how they see themselves or how they see others. And I think, together with DHHS and private agencies, the training of workers is going to be absolutely paramount and key to changing how we view these children or these families coming into the system.
And I think you really nailed it when you say how we view these families that are coming into the system. And this was kind of the next line of questioning I had, but I'm also going to grab onto one of our questions coming from our audience here in the town hall. And someone asked, is there any thought being given to prevent the bias against relatives? And we've touched upon this a little bit, and they go on to say, especially at the level of ability to license. We know the historical and systemic problems against families that have history with the system, but many of my placements as foster care parent have had a family member that appropriately worked with me, but were not able to be placed due to systemic requirements. Trisha, I'm going to go over to you on this and talk on the larger issue of trying to work with families in placement.
Yeah, so I wanted to mention that as part of that task force that Demetrius started and Director Starling, I'm having the same trouble, Brenda. There is a
I know it's my fault. I called him Demetrius and all of a sudden Law and Order went out the window.
So if I could just interject for a second, and I think Kim knows this is what I'm about to say. Demetrius is certainly fine. So please, you don't have
okay. I just wanted to mention that there's a relative fictive kin work group that I'm a part of that is kind of within the work of that task force. And so there is very intentional work being done on the relative and fictive kin policies and procedures and recommendations around that. And I see Kim nodding. She probably has things to add because I know she was very involved on CPS front end redesign. So there's just a number of kind of policy and procedure initiatives that are happening right now at the state level. And I think on the front end, what we're seeing in counties, and especially in Kent County where I'm at, we have a really low number of kids placed with relatives. And we're really trying to dig into that and figure out why is that. I think sometimes, and someone mentioned this in the questions, this is a really important point, that many families of color don't trust us. They don't trust our system. And so what can we do to build that trust and to help people feel like, it's okay to be honest about that I have these relatives. Some families are just not wanting to share that information because, I think there's a shame factor too. Like when your kids get removed, people don't necessarily want to put their business out to the world. But ultimately, we think it's best for kids to be placed with relatives or people that are like family to them. So that's what's known as fictive kin whenever possible. So there's a number of kind of policy and procedure things that play into that, but that is, I know, a high priority for the state of Michigan right now.
Or really trusted the system. Go ahead, Kim. I want you to pick up on this.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think that you're absolutely right, Trisha. It is very important, honest, and that oftentimes people of color have a lot of biases against the system. I know when I was raised like what happens in our house stays in our home, and not to let the system or anyone into our business. And so that is still very prevalent in the community that I grew up in. And so I think that is something that we have to examine. It shows me that we have a lot of work to do when we're talking about working with our communities, especially our communities of color. We owe it to them. Like you said, studies have shown that when children, first of all, we're hoping that prevention can take place so that people don't have to be removed. These young people don't have to be removed from their home. But when they are, can they stay with the relative? I think that's a very poignant point or question I was asked in the chat. And so oftentimes I know like there are families, I'll just say the Reese family. Well, we know Reese families, that Reese family, they're a big family and they're always in the system. So what? They still have value. So what? Like if you go to take a can back and it may have a dent in it, I can still redeem it for 10 cents, right? Because it still has value. So what if my brother or sister, if they have some sins or if they're not perfect? I'm not perfect. The person who's interviewing these families aren't perfect. And so it's time that we stop judging people because of our biases or the messages that we receive through the media about certain ethnicities and cultures. And so we need to get back to what's important, and that is keeping these young people connected to their community. And so I'm very happy, Trisha, that there is a work group that is working on this, because we can't do it alone. When you saw the slides, it already said that we were in need of foster homes. We're either in need of foster homes and we're going to license people and support them, or we're not in need of homes. And so we can't say that we need homes and then turn our backs on people because they may have got a speeding ticket. Like that just doesn't make a lot of sense. And so somewhere we're going to have to figure out how to level this out so that we can make sure that these young people are remaining connected closely to their communities.
I want to get back to the trust. Yeah, go ahead, Demetrius, jump in, because I was going to go to you next anyway. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing to that for the folks who are asking questions. Specifically about kinship care. So we are right now throwing a lot of resources and money into that particular subject. We've received guidance from CASA family, and one of the basic tenets that they continue to uphold with us is if we can engage our communities better and interact with them more and kind of tamp down on that stigma that we have as a department, that we're just here to dismantle families, that we're here to keep kids of color in care, then that'll be the first step in regards to kind of rebuilding our image. After that, we need to really embrace and wrap our arms around family members who are best, again, situated in the communities to take care of their kids. I think most people of color who are either on this call or in earshot of me will say that kinship care is extremely important in communities of color. Even if it's a quote unquote fictive kin, someone who's not related to you by blood, someone who's on your block, someone who knows your family well, those folks know what the needs of the families are in a lot of instances more than a foster family that may be foreign to that particular child. It's so important for us to keep kids engaged and connected to their communities from a cultural standpoint. But also we've seen, over the years, there's empirical data to show that kids sometimes, when they're removed from their culture, when they're removed from their communities, they struggle mightily in numerous areas, whether it be education, whether it be health disparities. And these things, the data does not lie. And these things truly concern us as a child welfare system. So as a result, we are throwing a lot of time and resources into how do we engage our communities, get aunts, uncles, grandparents, sisters, brothers engaged to come to the table and say, you know what, I'll take care of little Johnny. I'll take care of little Tasha, to make sure that they understand the importance of family before foster care.
And that they feel supported by the system. I think that answers a lot of some of the questions that we're seeing in the chat from Melanie, anonymous attendee. Brenda, I want to ask you, to maybe start to answer this question that we came in, because we're talking about keeping children with some kind of, with family in some way, shape, or form. But how does the system address, this is from someone watching with us, how will the system address the challenges of being a foster family to bridge the gap for families of color who are hesitant to become foster families? How can we make this easier for families of color to want to be that foster family if they're concerned about safety or any other kind of barrier?
Well, that is a loaded question, and the million-dollar question, I think, that all of us would like the perfect answer to. However, there is no perfect answer. In reducing racial disparities, it requires specific strategies aimed at eliminating bias and ensuring that we have a level playing field for all children and children of color. Understanding the biological bias of our bias is the first step in learning how to overcome it for good. I think that as workers, if we are able to overcome some of our biases, then we are able to treat our clients, our foster parents, better. And that will show over time. We cannot expect that today we're going to change a whole population, a way of looking at the system, because we say we're going to do the right thing today. We actually have to be about it. We talk about it. We need to be about it. We need to show it. And that information really circulates word of mouth. Just as becoming a foster parent, many of us know that one of the best recruitment tools is word of mouth, is one foster parent speaking to their friends or their relatives and saying, look, this is what's going on in the system, in the foster care system. You need to come over here and join us. The problem that we're having now is a lot of the foster parents that we currently have a negative view of the system as well, and they're licensed. And so that information then is provided to anybody else who's around them and in their circle. And so, people look at it and it's like, well, I don't want this much intrusion in my life. So we do need to make licensing simpler, and the requirements for the relatives simpler. And one thing that has really, I think, improved for relatives and even for birth parents is Zoom, and especially with court hearings, because now everybody can attend, everybody can participate. So everybody is hearing the same information. Often when that was not the case and it was in person, you basically received information based on how that person perceived what happened in that court hearing. And so you weren't able really to make an educated decision about what is going on with that case. So I think that it is key that we do the right thing by the current foster parents that we have, and they will become the ambassadors for helping us to recruit additional foster parents.
So Trisha, making sure that our current families are comfortable with the system, encouraging others. What would you say, because you said in Kent County, the majority of your foster families are white. What would you say that needs to be done to encourage more families of color and communities of color to become foster parents and foster families?
Yeah, that is a great question. And it's something that we're really working on right now and trying to figure out, to be honest. I think that we have to be very intentional about making ourselves, seen in communities of color and being at events and just really trying to build trust. Because I think so much of it is about trust, but also making folks aware that there's a need. So, I think just kind of putting that out there. So hopefully this is something that the audience hears, and this is true statewide, but we do need more families of color so that kids, when they have to be removed and placed in a foster home, can be placed in homes where they feel like this family looks like me and I fit in here.
And you said something, go ahead, please do, Brenda.
That the other thing that we need to be more intentional about is recruiting the father side of the family with the children who enter care. We tend to just look at the maternal side. I often joke that these are the most immaculate conceived children I've ever seen, because none of them have fathers anywhere according to our systems. And I think we need to do a better job as workers in identifying them, which opens the pool for different families to participate with caring for their children. Many times when these children come into care, families lose contact. And if the birth parent isn't providing them with accurate information, they really have no clue about what's happening in the system and what's happening to their children.
And both Brenda and Trisha, you talk about when a child has to be removed, and it really makes me wonder about what those parameters of removal are. And Kim, I want to go to you when we look at neglect and abuse and what those things mean. And the majority of children who are coming into the system, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's because of neglect. And there are different parameters for that. And that can also be something that, again, people's implicit bias can be looking at. And maybe this also down the line, and I'm sure you can all comment on this, and we did get some questions on this, and talking about that blind removal. And if we take certain things out of the picture and just look at why a child is initially, the report is coming in and why the removal process is happening. Can you explain a little bit, Kim, neglect and abuse?
Yep. So I think that, like I said in the beginning, I think it's very important for us to examine how these calls are coming in. So we know that we are doing some reworking of our centralized intake. And so it goes back to the reporters and the mandated reporters looking at, like, why are we calling this in? If you are a white person and you're calling in on a person of color, in particular a Black child, what if this child lived in your community? What if this child went to your place of worship? Would you be placing this call? So I think that before we even get to foster homes and recruitment of foster homes, we need to look at prevention. Prevention is going to be very, very important, because we know that if we can help families on the front end, then that is less support that they'll need on the back end, because we're doing everything that we can up front. And so when you talk about abuse versus neglect, we need to look at poverty. There's a difference between poverty and neglect. And so when we are training our new hires, we are making sure that they know the difference between poverty and neglect. When I was raised that curtains belonged on, that sheets belonged on a bed, not as curtains. But who cares if you go to someone's home and they have sheets up to their windows? That's not a matter of abuse or neglect. That could be a poverty-related issue. Not everyone has a bed frame. Sometimes babies have to sleep, in unconventional places. And I'm not saying putting a child at risk because of safety, but maybe they don't have, maybe they have to stay in that pack and play a little bit longer. So we do kind of work with our new hires, and it is something that we offer to both our private agencies and to our MDHHS staff. Like, we have trainings on poverty versus neglect and abuse versus neglect, making sure not just our new hires are aware of this, but we also have in-service trainings so that we can make sure that people are being, that they're being reminded that there is a difference and that we need to take all of this into consideration when we talk about the messages that we receive early on in life versus the experiences that we're having now in our workplace.
Brenda, you want to add to that?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I really got excited, Kim, when you said poverty versus neglect. We have a referee here in Oakland County, referee Lisa Harris, who often reminds the interested parties when they're looking at a situation or a scenario that, we need to be conscious of the fact of whether it is poverty versus neglect. And it gives you pause. You step back and look at the problem from a totally different lens. So you're absolutely correct, Kim. We do need to understand what is poverty and what is actually neglect. And actually the greater majority of the African-American children who come into the system because of neglect. So we would have to question why we aren't doing more with prevention with those families.
Demetrius, that would seem that I would kick that back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's incumbent on me to also address this from a particular standpoint, and I've done that by reaching out to my counterpart on the economic stability side. So we understand that a lot of our customers, we have that cross intersectionality, and in a lot of cases, we see that when there's that conflation of poverty, there's a CPS complaint that's called in. So what can we do, again, to be more preventive in our efforts and work more upstream? So we're working at how we can have folks from that side of the house work with our child welfare staff to see if there's anything that we can do to help meet the needs of our families, whether it be concrete items, addressing homelessness, making sure that if they need curtains, like Kim stated, they need curtains in their home, that we have funds and different ways, different funding sources to assist those families so it doesn't come to our attention, because we understand that in previous instances, there has been this over-policing kind of mentality from CPS where we're getting involved with families, more particularly families of color, when we don't need to. And so we can, from there, kind of reshift our resources to cases that really need the time and attention of our CPS staff.
Yeah, I just want to add, go ahead, please.
Just want to add that from a training perspective, as it relates to our assistance payment side, so they also receive some implicit bias training. So we don't just keep it on the child welfare side. That is something that their new hires receive as well, because we recognize that it's the same family, the same communities, and we want to make sure that the workers on both sides are hearing the same message.
Yeah, we got an interesting question from our audience. And again, we're so happy that you have joined us. This has been a spectacular discussion, and I think a very frank one on some of the impacts that we can do on the bias in the foster care system and what our children in Michigan are facing every day. Because the bottom line, it is how these children are going to be able to go back out into the world, and how they feel about themselves is where they have been raised and how they have been loved and how they have been cared for. And it is on all of us to be a part of the solution of that. I want to ask, this was interesting. Someone asked, are you seeing new social work graduates coming out of college? Are they better prepared, such as having received anti-bias training, more multicultural awareness, anti-racism coursework? And I think that's interesting because we do look at what is the next generation of social workers and what is the next generation of this workforce who will be caring for these children and in the system. What are we seeing from them? Who would like to take that?
So this is Kim, and I'll just start out with, from the training perspective, what I'll say is, to be honest with you, a lot of the staff that we are hiring from MDHHS perspective, a lot of them aren't necessarily social work students, but criminal justice students. And I think that that's important to know that. But what I will say is that I am very encouraged by what I'm seeing. Like, we have some very articulate, some very woke, if you will, young people who are just willing to challenge the status quo. So from a training perspective, I am seeing oftentimes, it does sometimes depend on where the new hires are coming from, but a lot of them really are very much aware. They are asking the right questions. And then there are other people who come from some smaller communities who may need some more support, or they may say something like, well, this is not, we don't have a lot of diversity, but it's still important. Diversity still matters. And perhaps there's a reason as to why you don't have diversity. Perhaps we should talk about that. And so, but overall, I am encouraged by whether they're social work students or criminal justice students, the amount of people that are willing to have the conversation and who are willing to have their views challenged.
Trisha, have you had any experience? Or go ahead, Demetrius.
Yeah, and also I would just add, just going back to one of the original topics of where these conversations start. So from a leadership perspective, what's being embedded in our department is that our leaders are attending race equity training through Erase, and they are a fantastic organization that's housed in Kalamazoo County, and they provide us that support and guidance in regards to how to identify racial bias, how to really take a look at some of the structural racist institutions that exist, and not only in our state, but throughout the nation, like Brenda stated. And how do we use these as learning experiences for ourselves so we can build our own capacity and be able to be that model for our staff going forward? So it's not only just a frontline staff perspective or concept, but it also starts at the top for us to make these transformative changes.
Trisha, did you want to add?
No, I think they both covered it really, really well. Yeah.
Okay. All right. You know what? We're getting close to the end. The questions have been wonderful. I want to go back down. One just came in saying, what additional supports can be provided to Black families as an incentive to be relative caregivers or to get licensed? We provide a subsidy that helps with the kids' care, but there's no support for the emotional toil the caregivers experience from having to unexpectedly change their lifestyles to accommodate a child. Brenda, you're nodding, so I'm going to go to you on that.
Absolutely. And that was a recent change in terms of providing subsidy for relatives who are providing care for these children. I think that we need to look at the services that we provide for foster families, when we place children in those homes, we provide wraparound services. We look at therapy. We look at, educational needs. And we need to put the same resources from our foster parents into our relatives to help them make these successful placements. Many times we just assume, well, they're family, so they know them. They'll do fine. They'll be okay. That's not necessarily the case. And you're absolutely correct. Your life is going to be impacted 100% with adding just one child to your family or another child to the family. And so we need to make sure that the workers are supportive of these families and providing them with the necessary resources to ensure that these are successful placements, and not just assume because they're a relative, they know how to make this work.
Demetrius.
Yeah, also it really falls back on us as a child welfare system to have that ongoing support going forward. It's not enough for us just to come in, look at the issues, provide support, and just say, okay, aunt, uncle, you have this. No, it takes ongoing support. It takes ongoing guidance. And, one of the analogies or metaphors that I use is that, I've told people time and time again, I'm almost 50 years old and I need support, in regards to raising my two daughters. And so why is it any different for our customer base, right? So we just need to make sure that we have that ongoing interaction, engagement, and conversations with our folks to make sure they know that we're there in their corners and we have our arms wrapped around them as a child welfare system.
Trisha, talk to me about some of the supports. Or just one second, I just want to get to Trisha real quick and tell about some of the supports that you're giving families, foster families right now.
So foster families or relatives or both? I think
both. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think that the question was around relatives, and it's such a good point because we do offer. I mean, they can receive a stipend, which is like a daily rate payment, but I think it doesn't get to that emotional toll that she was talking about. Like I said, relatives often they don't come into this. It's not like they're seeking out to become foster parents like our licensed foster homes are. They came to us intentionally saying, this is what I want to do. With families, it's like something happened and then suddenly we're at their doors asking them to, take on 1, 2, 3, 4 extra children. And the money I don't think covers the expenses of everything. And someone put in the chat too, just around, they may not have enough bedrooms. There are funds that are available that can help with some things, but I'm not sure that it really covers all of those needs. And so I think in terms of licensing, because we do want to try to license relatives when we can, but there are a lot of barriers to that I think there's a gap there, so I just want to kind of acknowledge that's something that we need to kind of look at as a system, like Demetrius said. And as far as there are support groups and things like that, but what we find is that, we sort of have a core group of foster families that typically engage in those types of things and others not so much. But I think it would be really nice to have an intentional relative foster like support group. So that's really just for relatives. So, because I think they understand what, those types of families are going through better than they're not the same. They're not having the same issues as a licensed foster home. So.
Brenda, I'll go back to you.
Oh, no, I was just going to add that I think we need to make them feel important. And we need to make them feel like they are a part of the team, not on the outside looking in.
All right, and that is going to lead me to our final thoughts. I'd like to go around to just each one of you today as we step back, and we talked about a lot, but what you would like to leave our audience with today. And so Kim, I'm going to start with you.
What I would like to leave with you today is, regardless of what's going on the news, what's going on in the community, is there is still hope. And so I know that many people may have had some negative experiences, whether it's with a private agency or MDHHS. You really do have the right people who are at the helm, who are trying to lead this work. And so if there's any way for you to get involved, whether it's personally or professionally, I leave you with hope. I am very encouraged with a lot of the work that's being done throughout the state of Michigan. So today I just leave you hope. And even if you've been discouraged, I want to let you all know that I am encouraged, and I hope that you will join me with hope.
Brenda, let me go to you. Some final thoughts.
I think that reducing racial disparities requires specific strategies aimed at eliminating biases and ensuring that there's a level playing field for everybody who is a part of this system. I think understanding the biological on the basis of our bias is the first step in learning how to overcome them. Other strategies to reduce the gap would include creating like multicultural teams of social workers, recruiting more Black social workers, minority families as foster parents, and relying more heavily, as we've just stated, on kinship caregivers. That includes your aunts, your uncles, your grandparents, who can step in during a time of crisis. But that also includes, as Demetrius stated, fictive kin, that I call pretend kin. That's that uncle's best friend who has been a part of the family forever, and everybody thinks that they are family until you're an adult and find out, oh, no. Well, he's not really your uncle. He's your uncle's best friend. Those people are important in these children's lives. And I think the more we can maintain our children with family, or the better off I think they will be in the end.
Trisha, some final thoughts for us.
I'm just really proud to be a part of this panel and so happy that we were having such a brave, courageous conversation today. And I think everything was so honest and frank. I know there were a lot of questions that we didn't get to in the Q&A, so I'm hoping that we can provide some follow-up afterwards. But just thank you to everyone who was here today. We really appreciate you coming.
Yes, and we will have an email that will go out to everyone who participated with us today for more information, and so we can continue this conversation because it's definitely not over. Demetrius, you want to end with some final thoughts for all of us?
Thank you, Christy. I appreciate it. I hope that everyone leaves this conversation, really feeling energized and ready to be activated within your communities. I hope the reoccurring theme throughout all of this conversation is that we can't do this work alone. And I think that with the makeup of this panel, it really signifies the importance of us being symbiotic in nature, just being, collaborative with some of our efforts going forward. And, us recognizing that as a department, we don't always have the right answers. This is demonstrated in the fact that we have the listening circles, we have the lived experiences groups that are convening now, where we're hearing directly from older youth, kids who have been in foster care systems, our biological parents, foster parents, because we really want to reimagine our system so it's more valuable and not as detrimental as it's been in the past. And I'm really encouraged. I'm really energized. I think that we have a great team in place here. Just to see that, again, that symbiotic nature between public and private is truly amazing. So I hope that everyone leaves this group feeling as if they play an active role in how we transform our systems going forward. Thank you.
Well, my thanks to you, Demetrius, of course, to Trisha and Brenda and to Kim for having these tough conversations and being very transparent about it and saying that the work needs to be done. But most of all, thank you for caring for our kids. So this has been our Samaritas State of Foster Care in Michigan Town Hall. Thank you for being with us. If we did not get to an answer of your question, just stay tuned. We will make sure that we continue to have these types of conversations and look for that email as a follow-up to the programming. Again, I'm Christy McDonald. I was grateful to be here today. It was an honor to facilitate this conversation. Thanks so much and have a wonderful afternoon.
I felt alone, scared, unwanted, like I didn't have a say in my life, until I met Patricia and Jeremy. They gave me the support, the home, and love I never had before. It's why I succeeded in school, and I'm able to do what I'm passionate about today. Now I'm ready to make it on my own because I know they'll always be there for me if I need them. And that is why I say yes to foster care.